On a cold morning in March of 1975, a man named Robert Callahan drove a brand-new John Deere 4430 off the lot of a dealership in Ottumwa, Iowa, and headed south on a two-lane highway toward 160 acres of rented ground that most people in Wapello County considered too thin to bother with. He was 31 years old. He had $4,200 in a checking account, a signed lease on that ground at $45 an acre, and no other assets worth mentioning. No land of his own, no equipment shed, no family farm to fall back on. His father had been a machinist in a Keokuk factory, not a farmer. His mother had grown up in Des Moines. Robert had learned what he knew about farming from 3 years of hired work on other men's ground, plus whatever he could absorb from the county extension office and a shelf of used textbooks he'd bought for $1 apiece at an estate sale in 1972. The John Deere 4430 had cost him $22,500. He'd financed $18,000 of it through the dealership at 8.5% interest on a 5-year note. The monthly payment was $369. That number was not abstract to him. He had written it on a piece of masking tape and stuck it to the dashboard of the tractor before he left the lot. Not as a reminder, he didn't need a reminder, but as a discipline, a way of keeping the reality of his situation visible at all times, right there in front of him, every hour he sat in that cab. The men at the elevator in Ottumwa heard about the new farmer on the Haskins ground. That was what people called the 160 acres, after the family that had owned it before the bank took it in 1971, and the general assessment was not encouraging. Gary Whitfield, who ran the elevator and had been watching Wapello County farmers come and go for 23 years, said it plainly to anyone who asked. A man with one tractor, rented ground, no equity, and no family safety net had about one bad harvest between himself and the end. One late frost, one dry August, one year when the corn just didn't come in the way you needed it to. That was all it would take. Gary had seen it happen to men with better starting positions than Robert Callahan, and he expected he'd see it happen again. What Gary Whitfield did not know, and what most people in Wapello County did not know, was that Robert Callahan had spent 3 years preparing for exactly the situation he was now in. Not preparing in the abstract, hopeful way that men sometimes prepare for things, but in the specific, methodical, almost obsessive way of someone who understands that the margin between success and failure in his chosen life is very thin, and that the only way to protect yourself against a thin margin is to know more than the next man about everything that touches it. Let me tell you what Robert had been doing during those 3 years of hired work, because it explains everything that came after. He had worked for 2 different operations. The first was a 600-acre corn and soybean farm outside of Bloomfield, run by a man named Everett Marsh, who was, by the standards of 1972, a progressive farmer. Everett used commercial fertilizer, kept detailed yield records field by field, and had just started experimenting with no-till planting on his lighter ground. Robert had worked for Everett for 18 months and had spent every evening he wasn't too tired to sit upright reading whatever Everett would lend him: extension bulletins, university trial reports, back issues of Farm Journal going back to 1965. He asked questions constantly. Everett, to his credit, answered them. The second job was with a custom farming operation out of Centerville that planted and harvested for a dozen different landowners across 3 counties. This was where Robert learned the business side, not the agronomy, but the economics. How to bid a job, how to calculate break-even on equipment, how to read a cash flow forward 12 months, and identify where the pressure points were going to be before they arrived. The man who ran the operation, a quiet and precise fellow named Leonard Voss, managed his equipment costs with a rigor that Robert had never seen before and never forgot afterward. Leonard knew the cost per hour of every machine he owned, the cost per acre of every field he worked, and the exact point at which a piece of equipment stopped making money and started costing it. He kept all of this in a ledger, updated weekly, and he reviewed it every Sunday evening at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a pencil. Robert had watched Leonard do this for a year and a half, and when he left to start his own operation, he took that habit with him. Not the ledger, that was Leonard's, but the discipline behind it, the refusal to let the numbers become vague, the insistence on knowing exactly where you stood at all times. So when Robert Callahan drove that 4430 south on Highway 63 in March of 1975, he was not a dreamer. He was a man with a plan that was specific enough to be tested and disciplined enough to be followed. And the first piece of that plan was the tractor itself. Now let me tell you why the 4430, because that choice was not accidental and not obvious. In 1975, if you were setting up a one-man farming operation and you had $22,500 to spend on a tractor, there were arguments for spending less. A good used 3020 or 4020 could be had for $8,000 to $12,000, and plenty of men in the county were farming successfully on machines that age. The argument for buying used was simple: lower payment, more cash for operating expenses, less exposure if things went wrong. Robert had considered this argument carefully and rejected it for a reason that was, at its core, about time. A used tractor needed more maintenance, more downtime, more of the thing that a one-man operation on rented ground could least afford to waste, which was hours in the field during the narrow windows when the fieldwork actually had to happen. Planting in Wapello County needed to be done in roughly a 3-week window in late April and early May. Harvest had its own window. Miss those windows, even by a few days, even by circumstances that weren't your fault, and you paid for it in yield, and yield was the only thing standing between Robert Callahan and that $369 monthly payment. The 4430 was reliable. It was the most proven machine in the John Deere line at that time. It had enough horsepower, 125 PTO horsepower, to run a full-size planter and a full-size combine head without laboring. And it was new, which meant Robert knew its entire history, which was nothing, which was exactly the history he wanted. He also made one other decision about that tractor that people thought was peculiar at the time. He learned to service it himself, completely. Not just the routine stuff, filters, oil, belts, but the deep mechanical work, injectors, hydraulic components, final drives. He bought the service manual from the dealer the same day he bought the tractor, studied it over the winter, and by the time he planted his first crop, he could perform every scheduled maintenance item on that machine without calling anyone. This saved him money. It saved him time. But more than either of those things, it gave him something harder to quantify: a knowledge of that machine's condition that no outside mechanic could match, because he was the only one who had ever touched it. The first year was hard, in the way that first years are always hard when the margin is thin and you are learning things that can only be learned by doing them. Robert planted 155 acres of corn on the Haskins ground, keeping 5 acres in the headlands for a hay crop he'd sell to a neighbor's cattle operation. The spring was wet, and he planted later than he wanted. The summer was dry in July, but recovered in August. The harvest came in at 112 bushels per acre, which was below the county average of 118, but above the break-even number he had calculated the previous winter, which was 104. He made his payment. He made his rent. He had $1,100 left at the end of the year. $1,100. That was the margin. Not enough to absorb much, but enough to be still standing, which was what the first year required. At the elevator that winter, Gary Whitfield mentioned that the new man on the Haskins ground had made it through his first year. He said it in a tone that acknowledged survival without predicting what came next. The other men at the counter nodded. 1 year was 1 year. The county had seen plenty of men make it through year 1. Let me tell you about year 2 and year 3, because those years are where Robert Callahan started to become something different from what people expected. In the fall of 1975, while he was combining his last field, Robert heard from the Haskins ground landlord, a man named Paul Drescher, who lived in Ottumwa and had inherited the ground from an uncle, that the 80 acres on the east side of the property might be available for lease if Robert was interested. The current tenant, a man who had been farming it on a handshake agreement, had decided to quit. Paul wanted someone reliable. Robert said yes before Paul finished the sentence. Then he went home and sat at his kitchen table with his ledger and spent 2 hours making sure that yes was the right answer. The additional rent was $45 an acre, $3,600 per year. His equipment could handle the additional acres without another major purchase. The 4430 had capacity he hadn't been fully using on 160 acres. His operating costs would increase proportionally, but his fixed costs, the tractor payment, the insurance, the depreciation, would spread across more acres, reducing his cost per bushel. The numbers said yes. He had already said yes. But the exercise was not wasted. It confirmed that the decision was right, and it told him exactly how tight the margin on those 80 acres would be in a bad year, which told him exactly what kind of weather he could not afford and what contingencies he needed to have in place. He took the lease. He planted 235 acres in the spring of 1976 and came in at 124 bushels per acre on a year when the county averaged 121. His payment to Paul Drescher for both parcels was $10,800. His tractor note was $4,428 for the year. His net, after all costs, was $6,200. $6,200. He put $5,000 in savings and kept $1,200 for operating float. People in Ottumwa were still not paying much attention to Robert Callahan at this point. He was a young man farming rented ground, doing reasonably well, but nothing that distinguished him from a dozen other capable tenants in the county. He drove a used pickup. He didn't spend money on things that weren't directly productive. He showed up at the elevator, weighed his grain, collected his check, and went home. He wasn't a presence at the co-op meetings or the Farm Bureau dinners. He was simply a man who farmed and kept to himself. But the ledger was changing. By the end of 1977, year 3, Robert had $18,400 in the bank. His tractor was paid down to $9,200 remaining on the note. He was farming 315 acres across 3 separate parcels, all rented, all performing at or above county average. His cost per bushel had dropped every year as his fixed costs spread across more acres and as his management of the ground improved. He was applying fertilizer based on soil tests rather than blanket recommendations, adjusting seeding rates field by field based on the yield records he kept with the same weekly discipline he'd learned from Leonard Voss. Gary Whitfield noticed, that fall of 1977, that the Callahan ticket at the elevator had grown. 3 loads where there had been 2. A 4th parcel added to the haul tickets. He mentioned it to a banker named Frank Ostrander at the Ottumwa Savings Bank, who had his own reasons for paying attention to which farmers in the county were building equity and which were burning it. Frank Ostrander called Robert Callahan in January of 1978. This phone call is, I think, the most important moment in this story. Not the tractor purchase, not the first good harvest, not any of the individual decisions that made those harvests possible. The phone call from Frank Ostrander in January of 1978 because it opened a door that Robert had been working toward without knowing exactly how he was going to walk through it. Frank said he'd been watching Robert's account, said he'd pulled the elevator records for comparison, said he wanted to talk about what Robert's plans were for the next few years because the bank had some situations coming up that might be of interest to a man in Robert's position. What Frank meant, though he was careful not to say it directly at first, was that the farm crisis was beginning. Not the catastrophic crisis of the early 1980s, that was still a few years away, but the early tremors. Farmers who had over-leveraged in the early 1970s were starting to feel the first pressure. Land that had been bought at inflated prices on high expectations was not penciling out at current grain prices. Some of those farmers were going to need to sell or were going to be forced to sell, and the bank would be involved in those sales. Frank Ostrander was a careful man, and careful men at banks in 1978 were looking for buyers who could close reliably, pay consistently, and not default when conditions tightened. Robert Callahan, who had no debt except $9,200 left on a tractor, $18,400 in savings, and 3 years of documented performance at or above county average, was exactly the kind of buyer Frank was looking for. Robert listened to Frank for 45 minutes and said he'd think about it. He went home, sat at his kitchen table, and opened his ledger. He sat there for 3 hours. What he was calculating was not whether to buy land. The answer to that was already yes. Land was what you worked toward. Land was what converted your annual income from tenant income to owner income. Land was the foundation under everything else. What he was calculating was how much he could safely carry, at what price per acre, at what interest rate, with what down payment, in what kind of weather scenario. He built 3 scenarios: a good year, an average year, and a bad year. In all 3, he needed to be able to make his mortgage payment without selling assets and without defaulting. That constraint set his parameters. He called Frank back the next morning. The first purchase was 80 acres adjoining the east parcel of the Haskins ground, land that was coming to the bank through a voluntary sale by a family named Bertram, who were getting out ahead of their trouble. The price was $1,400 per acre, $112,000 total. Robert put $22,000 down, most of what he had, financed the rest at 9.25% on a 20-year note, and added those 80 acres to his farming operation in the spring of 1978. He now owned 80 acres and farmed 315 rented acres for a total operation of 395 acres. His fixed costs had jumped significantly with the mortgage payment added to the tractor note. His margin was thin again in the way it had been thin in 1975, but the thinness was different now. In 1975, the thinness was exposure. One bad year could end him. Now the thinness was leverage, the calculated use of borrowed money to build an asset base that would compound in value. There is a difference between those 2 kinds of thin, and Robert understood it clearly. He made the payment in 1978. He made it in 1979. Grain prices were strong those years, strong enough that even with the added debt service, his net was positive, and his savings were slowly rebuilding. And then 1980 arrived, and everything changed. I have talked about the farm crisis of the 1980s in other stories on this channel, and I don't want to spend too long on it here, except to say what it meant for Robert Callahan specifically. Interest rates climbed past 20% on new loans. Land values began to fall. Corn dropped below $2.50 a bushel at the same time input costs were rising. Farmers who had borrowed at high prices against inflated land values found themselves in a vice that no amount of good management could fully escape. Robert was not in that vice. His tractor note was paid off in 1980. He'd made an extra $2,800 payment in the fall of 1979 to clear it. His land mortgage was at a fixed rate, which meant the rising prime rate didn't touch him. His operating costs were lean because his equipment was maintained and paid for, and because his inputs were calibrated precisely to his soil tests rather than applied generously against optimism. In a bad market, his break-even was lower than almost anyone else farming comparable ground in the county. He lost money in 1980. Not catastrophically, he had cash reserves, but he lost money. He lost a smaller amount in 1981. In 1982, grain prices recovered slightly, and he broke even with a small positive margin. But here is what those 3 difficult years meant for Robert that they didn't mean for most of his neighbors. While other farmers were selling, Robert was buying. Not aggressively, not speculatively, carefully, deliberately, with Frank Ostrander's guidance and his own ledger's permission. In 1981, he bought 120 acres from a family that was surrendering it to the bank rather than go through foreclosure. The price was $980 per acre, 30% below what comparable ground had sold for in 1978. He put $18,000 down, financed the rest, and added it to his operation. In 1982, he bought 160 acres through a bank auction, $850 per acre. Another mortgage, another payment, another line in the ledger. In 1983, he bought 200 acres from a family named Strickland, whose patriarch had died in the spring, leaving debts that his sons couldn't service. Robert paid $900 per acre, which was fair given the market, and shook hands with the eldest Strickland son at the closing with a directness and quietness that the son remembered for years afterward. By the end of 1983, Robert Callahan owned 560 acres of Wapello County farmland, was leasing another 315, and was farming a total operation of 875 acres with the same John Deere 4430 he'd bought in 1975. Now 8 years old, carefully maintained, still reliable, plus a used combine he'd purchased in 1979 and a second tractor, a used 4240, added in 1981 when his acreage made a second machine necessary. His debt load was significant, but every acre of it was performing. Every mortgage was at fixed rates, negotiated when interest rates were lower, and every payment was covered in all but the most catastrophic weather scenarios by the productivity of the land itself. He was not comfortable. Comfort was not a word that appeared in his ledger, but he was building, steadily and deliberately, towards something that had been the point from the beginning. Gary Whitfield retired from the elevator in 1984. At his retirement party, someone mentioned that the young man who'd shown up 9 years earlier with one tractor and rented ground now owned more Wapello County farmland than anyone except the 2 largest family operations that had been farming there for 3 generations. Gary sat with that information for a moment. Then he said something that got repeated around the county for a while afterward. "I thought he'd be gone in 2 years," Gary said. "Turns out he was just getting started." In 1985, Robert bought the last significant piece of ground he needed, 240 acres on the western edge of the county that had been in the hands of a bank since 1983. It brought his owned acreage to 800. He still farmed 315 rented acres. His total operation was over 1,100 acres, all of it managed with the same discipline he'd brought to those first 160 acres in 1975. The same field-by-field yield records, the same weekly ledger, the same refusal to let the numbers become vague or optimistic. He was 41 years old. The John Deere 4430 was still in his shed. It had close to 14,000 hours on it by then. Some people thought he should have replaced it years ago. Robert kept it running because he knew every hour of its history, because it never let him down during a critical window, and because there was a principle involved that mattered to him beyond the practicality of it. The tractor had been the beginning, the discipline that bought it, the discipline that paid for it, the discipline that kept it running. That was what had built everything that came after. He wasn't sentimental, but he wasn't careless with meaning either. Let me tell you the last thing, because it's the part that people in Wapello County still talk about when this story comes up. In the summer of 1985, Robert was at the elevator when he ran into a man named Clifford Dale, who had farmed 800 acres in the county in the early 1970s, had borrowed heavily during the boom, and had lost everything in the crisis. Clifford was working at the elevator part-time. He was 58 years old and looked older. He recognized Robert and they talked for a few minutes, and at some point Clifford said, not bitterly, just as an observation, that he remembered when Robert had started out and most people in the county had figured he wouldn't last. Robert nodded. Clifford asked him what the difference was. Why had Robert made it when so many others hadn't? Robert was quiet for a moment. He wasn't a man who answered questions quickly when the question deserved a real answer. Then he said, I never borrowed against what I hoped would happen. I only borrowed against what I knew was already happening. Clifford thought about that for a moment, and then nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he hears something that explains a great deal that he had not previously understood. Robert picked up his grain tickets and walked back to his truck. The 4430 was parked out front, dusty from the field, a little oil-stained around the hydraulic fittings, still running as well as the day he'd driven it off the lot 10 years before. He climbed up into the cab, started the engine, and pulled out of the elevator onto Highway 63, heading south toward ground that had once belonged to other men and now belonged to him, built acre by acre from one tractor and one ledger and one simple refusal to confuse hope with knowledge. The county had thought he would fail. He had known otherwise. And the difference between what the county thought and what Robert knew was exactly 10 years, 800 acres, and one John Deere 4430 that he'd never stopped taking care of. What I keep coming back to with Robert Callahan is that masking tape on the dashboard. $369 a month, written out and stuck right in front of him every single day. That's not a trick. That's a philosophy. He never let the number become abstract, never let the payment become background noise. While everyone around him was borrowing against tomorrow's prices, Robert was only ever working with today's reality. That discipline, that refusal to look away from what's true, is what built 800 acres out of nothing. Not luck, not timing, just the daily decision to know exactly where he stood. If this story meant something to you, leave one word in the comments that describes Robert. Hit like, subscribe so you don't miss the next one, and share this with someone who needs to hear that starting small doesn't mean finishing small.